Hello, I'm Zash, and welcome to episode 62 of my Senjou no Maou, or The Devil on G-String, Let's Read. Joining me, as always, is my co-reader Faith. Last episode, we wrapped up the kidnapping crises, and Mizuha's chapter, with Kyousuke betraying Gonzo. And, to be fair, that took some balls. Gonzo is a bit intimidating. Usami, Tokita, and Mizuha have run off, and Gonzo dropped a bombshell. Kyousuke's mother died. Apparently to a drunk driver. Though, in an anime, I don't believe it until they see the body. And sometimes not even then. Anyway, please enjoy. My dearest son, I want to speak to you in person, his father wrote before the first trial. I'm not going to be able to avoid the death penalty. Thus, I don't rightly care if you take this letter as the rambling excuses of a murderer. I just want to detail the honest truth about the events leading up to my killing of Usami-san. I was born and raised in a fishing village in Hokkaido, the third son in my family. I moved to Tokyo to pursue higher education, and after graduating from college, I somehow managed to snag a position in the world-famous Sano Corporation. My days in their accounting division were hectic. An extraordinary volume of goods passes through the hands of a huge company like Sano each day. They were purchased overseas, imported, manufactured, transported, distributed, and the debris and credits associated with each step required a monstrous effort and nerve-wracking perseverance to keep straight. One day, as I was intensively double-checking our service and purchase costs in preparation for the end of the current billing period, I collapsed from exhaustion. I suppose these things finally caught up to me. Nevertheless, it was a happy occasion, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. For that was the day I met your mother, who was working as a nurse at a nearby hospital. I soon found myself making up excuses to my boss just so I could sneak out to visit her there. You boys have always known your mother as a cheerful woman whose cooking would satisfy royalty, but at work she was a bit shy and had a hard time holding conversations. She wasn't very good with people, and trying to socialize with her colleagues wore on her nerves.
She's an introvert.
Yeah. She later told me that her nursing work aggravated her anxiety so much that she began to take tranquilizers. But, as you know, your old man was straightforward, persuasive, and a frivolous joker. I guess I shouldn't be surprised when my son Kyousuke gets described in the same way, huh? I asked her to marry me barely 1 month after meeting her. Oh, that was quick.
Some people do.
I rushed things along because I knew how things worked in trading companies. One never stays in one place for too long.
Okay, that's fair.
Anyway, I took her to an amusement park and then gave her the ring at a hotel restaurant that evening. Luckily for me, your mother was also interested in me. Her beautiful white skin turned bright red, and I remember she nearly fell out of her chair in surprise. I went to visit her parents the very next day, and before we knew it, we were married. Supposedly, the people at the ceremony called me a wife-stealer. Soon after, as I predicted, I was transferred to Germany. Your mother came along without a single complaint. We had our first child there in Europe, far away from our homeland. That child was you, of course.
I'm guessing this is to Kyosuke's brother, not him.
It did mention he died in a terrorist attack.
Okay. One way or t'other, he's dead.
Apparently, it was a difficult delivery. You came out legs first.
Oh, that's bad.
Bad, but not fatal, like.
Yeah, it can be fixed, but still not good.
Yeah, it's uncommon, but not the worst thing that can happen in a delivery. Your old man wept at the sound of your first cry. It was completely out of character. We lived in Germany until you were 3 years old. You were a playful little boy. Your first words were amusement park. Germany had nothing but those mobile carnivals, so when we returned to Japan, I made sure to take you to a full-fledged theme park. I want to play every day, forever. I was quite worried for your future when you said those words. But, much to my relief, you turned out to be a genius. They called me to your elementary school once you had taken an IQ test, and all your mother could say later was that a duck like me had raised up a swan. For a long time, as you know, our family enjoyed peaceful days. My mousy wife, who suddenly became a lioness, went home with her boys. My 2 sons, frivolous Kyousuke and cold, passionate Kyohei, the 4 of us lived happily. Hey, did you ever notice this tidbit? Though it seemed like I was gone overseas on business most of the time, I was always home for Bon, New Year's, and your birthday. Now that I think about it, those were the happiest days of my life. So, when was it that I met Usami Yoshinori? Usami-san was a capable man working as a sales manager at a construction firm under the Sano Corporation's umbrella. You've heard of the Tomenbetsu City Outer Underground Discharge Channel, right? It's being constructed under the city as a drainage route for rainwater. If it ever gets completed, they say it'll be 50 meters deep and one of the largest underground open spaces in the world. The first time I met Usami-san, he boasted about how he had plucked the privilege of building the outer underground discharge channel from the whole country. He held his head high, like a samurai, and talked in a dignified manner. I met the man when I was transferred to that huge, nationally recognized project. I say, the first time I met him, but I suppose that's a lie. I first encountered him back in my school days, through an activist group we both attended. Activism was all the rage back in those days. It may sound hard to believe now, but I was bad news back then. I took over an authoritative position in an activist group from a neighboring town. This position allowed me to manage their funds. It was some fairly risky business. And to this very day, I still have police coming to my door from time to time. Yeah, especially after you murdered someone!
Yeah.
Usami-san and I had a riot discussing old times. For example, there was a time we barricaded ourselves in one of the school buildings. But, as we looked back on everything, both Usami-san and I realized that we hadn't done what we did out of any productive ideals or anything. There was merely something wrong with us. At least, that's the conclusion we both reached as we sat around drinking together. After about 2 weeks, we had gotten close enough that Usami-san invited me over to his house. Much to my surprise, it wasn't a house at all. It was a small apartment that seemed to be at least 20 years old. I suppose I expected him to live more luxuriously, seeing as he had such a distinguished career. I do have quite a bit of savings, but I don't come home very often. He laughed as he said that. I found that rather strange. I had heard he had a wife and daughter. However, I understood when he told me his wife's name. I was astonished, and I must admit, even a bit jealous. His wife was Mishima Karu, a famous violinist. He said he had waited to tell me so that it would come as a bigger surprise. He'd always had the nature of an entertainer and enjoyed his dramatics more than most. So that's where Usami gets it.
Yeah.
I'm sure I've told you before, but I'm a huge fan of Mishima-san. Her world tours brought her performances to audiences across the globe, from Moscow to New York. She must have been incredibly busy. It's only natural she wouldn't have the time to go home. It made me feel incredibly sorry for their daughter, Haru. Her father was as wildly successful as her mother, and between all the transfers and travel, the poor girl must have been left behind more often than not. I doubt she received the love and attention she needed to develop as a child should. The general consensus about little Haru-chan was that she was a strange kid, and sure enough, when I knocked on the door to her room that fateful first visit, she didn't respond at all. No greeting, no acknowledgement. Only the sound of a violin betrayed her presence within.
This song is for you,
She eventually said, and began playing Air on the G string. Apparently she was rather like you. She was born in Germany and had learned to play the violin from the age of 5. She had her mother's talent, and the girl's rendition was truly beautiful. At that point, you could say Usami-san and I were friends. Nevertheless, Haru-chan kept to herself all the time. It made me want to bring her home to meet you and your brother. God knows, the girl had probably never been to a proper family gathering. However, I was never given the chance. The more I was with Usami-san, the more he invited me to play mahjong. One day, as he was kicking my ass at the game, Usami-san cheerily told me about his family situation, that he was the 4th son in a family of bureaucrats, and that despite having the brains and connections to be a politician, he continued to work at his current company. It was only when he began to insult his father, who was a famous member of the cabinet, and his brothers that I realized something was not quite right. And I assure you, it wasn't a side effect of my many losses at mahjong. I later found out that his family had disowned him. But he certainly wasn't a worthless man. He was a good leader to his subordinates on the Underground Channel project, and he took initiative when negotiating with subcontractors. He practically became a corporate legend after heading alone into the director of senior management's office, a man named Somiya, with a bottle of whiskey to propose an increase in the project's budget. Usami was a man of both humor and wit, and to be quite honest, it's not surprising that he was able to win over Mishima Kaoru. "Samajima-san, I've got a favor to ask," he said in his usual dramatic tone one night after we'd finished a dinner meeting at a high-class restaurant in downtown Tokyo. "I believe you'll find it to be quite a tempting offer." He said he wanted to start his own business in the near future. Not one under the Seno Corporation umbrella, but his very own company. "You're the first person I've mentioned this to," he said, as passionately as a child. He had a tendency to boast about his plans, but his talent was recognized both within the company and around Japan's business world. I was sure he'd be a success, and I told him I was rooting for him. "I want you to be my partner." I'd half suspected this conversation was headed in that direction, but he openly invited me to join his new company. He respectfully bowed to me and offered to make me a manager if I invested some money in the company. I felt bad about it, but I rejected his offer. I didn't have any ambition. I was happy with my current job, and most of all, if I had time to start a business, I'd rather spend it with you and the rest of our family. "I'm sad to hear that," Usami-san said. "I'm sorry. I've got a baby girl on the way, you see." "Really now? Congratulations. You've always said you wanted a girl. Have you decided on a name yet?" The child I named Kiyomi was born with a genetic heart disease, as you two already know. It was the first baby girl in our home, which had, until then, been blessed only with boys. My excitement was probably enough to make you two jealous. And she was a handful, wasn't she? We had to take her to the hospital twice a week, and your mother nearly collapsed from anemia. And when your mother was feeling too ill to change your noisy little sister's diapers, you diligently volunteered to do it yourself. You were such a kind-hearted boy. Nevertheless, Kiyomi died. She was only 15 months old. She passed on a peaceful day, one heavy with the traces of the coming spring. Your mother said she looked like she was sleeping. Do you remember the quiet funeral, son? It was only the four of us, yet you didn't shed a single tear.
See, that concerns me.
For what reason was she born? You shouted up at the clear winter sky. You were just a boy, but life had already driven you to curse God. A week or so after Kiyomi died, Usami-san came to me with 3 of his subordinates. They were clad in mourning clothing and suddenly bowed to me. "I'm very sorry for your loss," he said, choking back tears. Usami-san raised his head and didn't try to hide the overflowing tears pouring from his red eyes. Ah, he's crying for Kiyomi, I thought, naively moved. After all, he had given clothes to my baby girl when she was born. I completely dropped my guard around Usami-san. He made time to take me to an expensive restaurant in Ginza once. "The wife stole off to Berlin and took Haru with her. I'm feeling pretty lonely myself," he said, and I completely believed that the man smiling bashfully before me was a true friend. "How much do you need?" "What do you mean?" "You talked to me about investing before, remember? You needed funds to start up your own business. If you want my help, it's yours." "Oh, don't be silly. I can't do that, Samajima-san. You've got a family to take care of. You can't have the time to be answering to my whims." "You're right. I'm sorry, but I can't leave my current job to go with you. Still, I'd like to lend you something as a token of my gratitude." I had put aside 5 million yen for Kiyomi's medical bills. So, at that time, I figured it wouldn't do any harm to invest that in a friend who cared about Kiyomi enough to shed tears. I had already saved enough money to put 2 boys through schooling, and with my high-paying job at the top-class company, I had also probably forgotten the value of 5 million yen. "Thank you very much. I'll repay this debt many times over." Thinking back on it now, I realized that Kiyomi's death had clouded my judgment. I made a few small blunders at work, and occasionally took out my frustration on your mother. So, after offering a stick of incense to Kiyomi's portrait, I signed Usami-san's investment contracts. My signature was only needed on one of the 2 papers. We had the contracts notarized the next day. It's only now that I question why I needed to sign something in order to invest in his company. I've learned this oversight so many times since that day. Why did I not read the other of the 2 papers? How could an accountant at Sano Corporation fall for such a simple ploy? I will be asked these questions at my trial. I'm sure of it. They will grind this point into the dust, doubting my sensibility, my common sense, and even my sanity. Forgive your foolish old dad. After that day, Usami-san almost never met with me for a meal. I brushed it off, thinking he was just busy building the outer underground discharge channel and setting up his own business. But then, one weekend, when we were preparing to go on a family camping trip, a huge man in a jet black suit and blood-red shirt showed up on our doorstep. I met a few radicals during my stint in student activism. They all had uncanny facial expressions, and their eyes glistened with their deviant ideals. Not a one of those twisted men had half the overwhelming atmosphere of this bestial man.
50 million in all.
He spoke in a tone that said he wouldn't take no for an answer, and I trembled in fear. It wasn't hard to recognize that giant as a Yakuza debt collector. He held a promissory note up to my face. I couldn't believe it. I had apparently at some point become the guarantor of someone named Katoi Takayuki. I knew the name. He was one of Usami-san's subordinates, and I'd played mahjong with him a few times. I had no idea what was what, and I asked him to leave. He obeyed me that day. However, his frozen eyes told me that next time, he wouldn't be so lenient.
It's good to know that Gonzo started small.
Yep.
He didn't just walk in and take over.
I can still see the worry in your mother's eyes that afternoon. I was taken aback when I looked at the promissory note. The loan had a principal of 5 million yen, but an unpayable amount of interest had accrued. As the man said, 50 million in all. Promissory note in hand, I drove over to Usami-san's apartment. Mishima-san and Haru-chan weren't there. In their places were 3 men, including Kato Takayuki, and Usami-san playing mahjong without a care in the world. I never intended to trick you, Samajima-san. I said I'd invest 5 million in you. I didn't say I shouldered your 50 million yen in debt. But you did sign the promissory note, did you not? Usami-san's acting was stellar. He tilted his head as if to say I was acting strange. If at this point I'd realized the trick Usami-san used on the promissory note, I wouldn't have had to resort to murder. I'm still not quite sure as to what happened, but Usami-san had somehow hidden something within these 2 contracts that exploded into my 50 million yen debt to the devil. Anyway, 50 million. You can pay it for my subordinate Kato, yes? It's not like it's an unpayable sum for someone in a top-rate firm like yourself, his arrogant chin seemed to say. Isn't this a crime, Usami-san? Don't be silly. Where's the proof of that? This is fraud. I'll report you to the police. That's fine with me. If you do that, I'll just go ahead and report all of your recent screw-ups to Somiya back at headquarters. At this point, there wasn't a single employee at the company who was not aware of the close friendship between Usami and Director Somiya. I myself had heard rumors about employees being fired the day after doing no more than glaring at Usami-san, and as foolish as I was, I believed them. But if I were indeed a criminal, Samajima-san, I'd be in good company. Remember when we entertained that fellow from the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, and Transport at the restaurant in Akasaka? Along with his female companion? I'd say that was a fine example of excessive reception. Now, remind me again who headed up that little event? Deftly rolling a mahjong tile in his fingers, he spoke up triumphantly. You were sure enjoying yourself that night, he continued, prompting one of his subordinates to laugh. You were drooling all over that woman, despite being a married man. The laugh spread through the room. The talk about starting your own business was a lie, then? I asked in desperation. No, it was true, but it's something I'll put more thought into later. At the moment, I'm devoted to finishing the outer underground discharge channel. I thought of Kiyomi, who died without living even a fraction of a full life. Those tears were fake too, weren't they? I will curse Usami's false sobs, even from the very platform of the gallows. Could you please leave? I have a winning hand here. I spoke with the corporate lawyer at Sano about how a friend of mine defrauded me, but in the end, he said I had no choice but to pay up. Even after taking out all my savings, I still couldn't reach 50 million. I'm not much of an extravagant spender, but your sickly mother's medical expenses and Kiyomi's operation bills weren't cheap, and they really took a toll on our family finances. Sucking up to my parents, being scorned by my relatives' cold eyes, planted a dark emotion in my very soul. Why am I in this situation? I bottled my anger at the unfair circumstances. I bottled up my anger at the unfair circumstances as I prostrated myself daily before a collector by the name of Azai Gonzo. I've paid off 20 million now, Usami-san. Please take care of the rest. I confronted Usami-san in broad daylight as he gave a presentation at the company. Usami, surrounded by corporate executives, wasn't fazed in the slightest. Could you pick a better place for this? Why should I cover for your debts? The cheek! I lost myself in anger, and the next thing I remember, I was grabbing him by the collar. That, naturally, was exactly what he planned for me to do. No one in the company would listen to me after that act of violence. All that awaited me was a week-long suspension and a cut in my salary. With nothing else to do but cry myself to sleep, I returned home and knelt in front of Kiyomi's portrait every day. I trembled in anger, day in, day out. Anger towards Usami, anger towards my foolishness. My nerves were so on edge that I'd begun to believe that Usami killed Kiyomi himself. My lawyer says that my unsound mind at the time would help in an insanity plea. Months passed, and I still had no means to which to repay the debt. Meanwhile, Usami's effort finally paid off, and he was promoted to a senior executive manager. He headed the Outer Underground Discharge Channel project, which boasts being the largest underground structure ever built. In front of that, my existence must have been trivial to him. Well, son, should I have forgiven this man? I feel bad for you three, my family. But Usami cried fake tears at Kiyomi's death and laughed inside his heart. You cried out to the heavens at how unfair Kiyomi's death was. For what reason was she born, you said? Was Kiyomi born into this world to be used by Usami? Of course not, right? Just before I committed the act, I was called out by Usami. Usami, ever the man of pleasure, was addicted to gambling on illegal horse races. At first glance, the place looked like a regular coffee shop. But the kind of people who gathered there weren't there to drink coffee. They were all dressed too shabbily to be the typical posh clientele of such a place. They all stared at the television screen, watching the race with an excited air about them. "Keep this a secret from my wife and daughter," he said cheerfully, and I was at a loss for words. "Looks like you're having some money troubles." "Whose fault do you think that is?" I wanted to shout. "Do you know about the Sonoyama Group?" It was a Yakuza organization operating out of Tomenbetsu City. If you work in construction for a while, you can get connections with these kinds of people. You're overdramatic as ever. What are you talking about? I have a favor to ask of you. To make the story short, he wanted to embezzle from Sano. And he wanted the cooperation of the lead accountant, me. He said we could give the Yakuza a cut as well. How about it? If you accept my offer, I might ask them to ease up on collecting your debt. A cruel smile formed upon his thin lips. It was only then that I truly understood the events of the past few months. This man had been trying to trick me from the very start. Getting my signature on that accursed contract was only the beginning. Usami-san, do you have no concept of decency? Usami just laughed out his nose. Samajima Toshikatsu. Your name itself is a testament to your destiny to lose at everything you do. Toshikatsu is victory spelled backwards. Defeat. And Samejima? That admiral who lost Japan the war. No one would heed morality lessons preached by such a profound loser. We're not in college anymore. As an adult, I'm questioning whether you have any sort of moral values. You aren't fighting a war, you're just bullying the weak. You have a daughter too, don't you? How would you feel if what happened to my daughter happened to Haru? You say it like I killed Kiyomi-chan or something. How cruel. My subordinates and I even went to the trouble of going to pay our respects. That must have been the moment where my passing fancies of killing him became more than just fancies. In any case, don't you and your wife consider your age? It's common knowledge that having children at an old age carries danger with it. Usami was clever. His mind had tapped somehow into the powers of hell. He really hit me where it hurt. My sin. When the doctors told me about the abnormality in Kiyomi's heart, I was plagued with guilt. The only child I've made is Haru. Unlike your children, Haru is a brilliant daughter. She has my genes, after all. So, she's demon spawn? No, she's an angel. Naturally. What father would think otherwise about his child? I know that Haru, with her tiny violin, wasn't at fault for anything. But hatred burned in my heart, and I felt that the only way to strike at this beast in human clothes would be to kill his daughter. Air on the G-string danced in my head. Men's minds are strange things, as they correlate sensations like music to memories and emotion. Thus, Air on the G-string became the soundtrack to my revenge against Usami. Son, what will your mind's eye paint in your heart when you listen to Air on the G-string? Ellipses. Megalipses. It's hard to believe this magical scenery was made by the hands of man. The Tomenbetsu City Outer Underground Discharge Channel. It's also called the Underground Shrine, a giant superpressure cistern. It collects the rainwater that drains into it through an underground tunnel network, then opens up into a nearby river. Water is the source of life, but can sometimes cause terrible disasters. It was fear, the fear of flooding, that brought the people who constructed this together. They pooled their intelligence to make this disaster prevention facility. It was also Usami Yashimori's lifelong desire. Father. Soon, I swear. Soon, I too will hear air. The G-string of a celestial violin will be passed from one generation to the next. I'll save you, Father. Soon. Megalipses. Ellipses. I went to the police forensics lab. It was a tiny, cramped room. One corpse lay strewn out. The glossy white sheet stood out amongst the dull, dim darkness. Yes, it was definitely my mother. I somehow managed to squeak that the thing before me, with the strangely disfigured head and body, was indeed Mum. The policeman sighed, then said, "Now we finally do an autopsy. My beautiful mother." The woman who hugged me tightly as I shook from the cold. The woman who gave her body and soul to protect me from that monstrous man. Her head was caved in, yet it was definitely Mum. Despite recuperating at home after a diagnosis of severe clinical depression, she apparently suddenly gathered her things and dashed outside at 7 p.m. on the day of the accident. They found a plane ticket to Tokyo Haneda Airport on her person. It seems she planned to take the red eye to Tokyo. The accident occurred as she tried to get on the bus to the airport and crossed the intersection. Apparently, the crosswalk light was green. Nevertheless, a car smashed into her at 75 miles per hour. The driver, a young man, tried to get away, but a nearby patrol car chased and ultimately apprehended him. A quick inspection revealed that he had been drinking. I wonder how Usami and Tokida fared in their own escape. What punishment awaits me now that I've betrayed Gonzo? I just don't care anymore. One of the items found among my mother's belongings was a handmade scarf. I clutch it tightly as I stare at the floor in my dark, lonely room. Someone, please answer just one question. What sin did my mother commit to lead to her death? She had planned to come surprise me with a visit. I should have gone to Sapporo to pick her up. Years ago. I should have gone to live with her, even if it meant leaving Gonzo's side. Yet, I continue to follow Gonzo, determined to make a name for myself in the underworld. What a childish dream. Wasn't my goal all along to take care of my ailing mother? I treated it as my one and only shining, albeit tiny, hope. Poor Mom. Her husband was a murderer. She was so deep in debt that she fell mentally ill. And to top it all off, she died an unfair, untimely death by vehicular manslaughter. Where is the justice in this goddamned world? Angels do not exist. How could they? If they did, I would have a firmer grip on my sanity. I wouldn't be grasping at burning hatred to protect my humanity. The only things keeping me from losing my mind are the finely detailed visions of myself killing the driver who murdered my mother. A headache tears at my skull, but right now, I almost feel blessed with this pain, this pleasure, this punishment, this retribution from God upon a pathetic boy who couldn't save his mother. I vaguely see a light at the end of the tunnel. I might be able to reach it if I lend myself to this headache. I couldn't hold back my laughter. I felt refreshed, as if the seeds I had planted that failed to sprout had actually only waited for the opportune moment, and were now reaching for the sun. Maou, huh? I think back on all the incomprehensible events of the past winter. The ransom stolen from the Tsubaki family. The attempts on Izai Gonzo's life via car bombing. Thinking about it now, there was something I didn't like about Tsubaki. And it was Gonzo that kept me from seeing my mother. I had plenty enough motives. And zero alibis, actually. All of the actions occurred while I wasn't feeling well. My memory of those events is too hazy to interpret. Oh yes, and let's not forget Dr. Akimoto's enthusiastic, romantic diagnoses. The suspicious looks from Usami and Gonzo. I thought it was impossible before, but now I want to believe it. No, I'm ready to believe it. After all, what is truly impossible? Surely it was impossible for my mother to be killed in an accident. preposterous things happen every goddamn day. So, maybe I really am Maou.